The colonel died with a secret stuck in his throat and a pair of stinking boots in his hand. He left the gold to his wife and the garbage to his most loyal worker. Everyone at the Estancia dos Jacarandas watched and laughed, but what they didn't know was that the dead man had set one last trap. Inside that hollow heel lay the truth that would turn the mistress into a beggar before the sun went down. The air at the plantation was thick that morning. It smelled of damp earth, and the heavy scent of lilies meant to cover the smell of a rotting body. Colonel Custodio was finally cold. He was a man who ruled with an iron fist for 40 years, but in the end, his heart just gave up. Or that's what the doctor said. Bento knew better. Bento had been the one to bring the colonel his coffee every morning for 3 decades. He had seen the way the colonel's hands started to shake. He had seen the way Donna Leonor, the widow, looked at the silver tray with eyes that didn't hold a single drop of grief. The moment the colonel's eyes closed for the last time, the masks fell. Leonor didn't wait for the body to get cold. She didn't even wait for the priest. She walked straight to the mahogany desk in the master's study, pulled out a drawer, and found a single sheet of paper. It was the manumission document, Bento's freedom. The colonel had promised him that paper for years. He had signed it, stamped it, and kept it safe. Bento was standing in the doorway, his old hands trembling, his back bent from years of mending boots and saddles. He saw the paper in her hand. He saw the flickering candle on the desk. "That's mine, Signor," Bento whispered. His voice was like dry leather rubbing together. Leonor didn't even look at him. She held the corner of the parchment to the flame. The fire licked the edges, turning the ink of his freedom into black smoke. She watched it burn until it reached her fingers. Then she dropped the ashes onto the floor and ground them into the rug with the heel of her silk shoe. "You belong to this house, Bento," she said. Her voice was cold, like a knife kept in a cellar. "And you will belong to it until I decide otherwise. Notice this. Some people call this custom, but it's cruelty with a first and last name. The injustice didn't stop there. Leonor was in debt. Deep debt. The estancia was a beautiful shell, but the inside was rotting with gambling markers and unpaid loans the colonel had kept hidden. She needed to sell the land, and she needed to do it fast. But she also wanted to humiliate anyone who had been close to her husband, especially Bento. 3 days later, the entire plantation was gathered in the main courtyard. The sun was a white-hot hammer beating down on the workers. The house slaves, the field hands, even the overseer Juvenal was there, leaning against a post with his whip coiled at his belt like a sleeping snake. Donna Leonor stood on the porch, dressed in black lace that cost more than a dozen men. She held a burlap sack in her hand. Everyone thought it was the legacy the colonel had mentioned on his deathbed. A few coins, a bit of land. "My husband was a man of many secrets," Leonor announced to the crowd. Her eyes scanned the tired faces until they landed on Bento. In his final moments, he asked that his most precious possession be given to his most loyal servant. He wanted Bento to have his legacy. She reached into the bag and pulled out a pair of boots. They weren't the polished riding boots the colonel wore to the capital. They were old, torn, and caked in dried mud. The leather was cracked, the soles were flapping like hungry mouths, and they smelled of the swamp. She tossed them off the porch. They landed in the dirt at Bento's feet with a wet thud. "There is your freedom, old man," she sneered. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd, led by Juvenal. "Wear them well. Maybe they'll help you walk faster when you're working the North Fields tomorrow." Bento didn't say a word. He looked at the boots. He looked at the mud. He felt the sting of the laughter more than he felt the heat of the sun. He reached down with his scarred, calloused hands and picked them up. They were heavy, much heavier than old leather should be. He tucked them under his arm and walked away. He didn't head for the fields. He headed for his small shack near the stables, the place that smelled of tanning oil and old hide. He could feel Juvenal's eyes on his back. The overseer wasn't laughing anymore. He was a greedy man, and he knew the colonel wasn't the type to give away garbage without a reason. Inside his shack, Bento sat on a low stool. He placed the boots on his workbench. The right boot was in worse shape than the left. The leather was nearly rotted through at the ankle. But as he turned it over, his thumb brushed against the heel. Click. It was a small sound, Almost nothing. But to a man who had spent 40 years working with leather, it was as loud as a gunshot. A hollow heel. He reached for his paring knife, the one with the bone handle. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He knew if Leonor or Juvenal walked in now, they would kill him just for looking too closely at a dead man's trash. The problem was, Bento wasn't just a servant. He was a master of his craft. He knew how leather should move, how it should weigh, and how a heel should be balanced. This boot was wrong. It was a masterpiece of deception. Outside, the wind began to pick up, whistling through the cracks in the wooden walls. The Estancia dos Jacarandas was a place of ghosts and shadows, and Bento felt like he was holding the biggest ghost of all in his hands. He heard footsteps outside. Heavy, rhythmic. Juvenal. Bento quickly threw a piece of raw cowhide over the boots. The door kicked open. Juvenal stood there, the light from the setting sun silhouetting his massive frame. He smelled of cheap tobacco and sweat. "The mistress says you're to be in the sugar mill at dawn," Juvenal barked. He stepped into the cramped space, his eyes darting to the workbench. "What are you doing with that trash, old man? Thinking of fixing them up and running away?" "They are a gift from the master," Bento said, his voice steady. "I am cleaning them, out of respect." Juvenal laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He walked over and snatched the cowhide away. The boots sat there, pathetic and ugly in the dim light. Juvenal picked up the left one. He turned it over, shook it, and even stuck his dirty finger inside the torn lining. "He must have really hated you," Juvenal said, tossing the boot back down, "to leave you his filth while he leaves the lady the gold. But you listen to me, Bento. I'm watching you. If I find out you're hiding so much as a copper coin in this hole, I'll skin you like one of your hides." Juvenal left, slamming the door behind him. Bento didn't move for a long time. He waited until the footsteps faded, until the only sound was the cicadas in the trees and the distant sound of the dinner bell at the big house. He picked up the right boot, the one Juvenal hadn't inspected closely. He felt the heel again. There was a seam, hidden perfectly under a layer of wax and dirt. It was a professional job. The colonel hadn't done this himself. He had paid someone, or maybe he had forced someone. Bento took his knife and carefully, millimeter by millimeter, began to pry at the edge of the leather. His hands didn't shake now. This was his world. This was the only thing he had left. As the leather began to give way, he saw a glimmer of something metallic. A small iron key tucked into a bed of wool to keep it from rattling, and beneath the key a tightly rolled cylinder of parchment protected by a thin layer of oilcloth. Bento's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know how to read well, only a few words here and there, but he knew an official seal when he saw one. The red wax was stamped with the imperial crest. But what he didn't know was that the colonel hadn't just left him a secret. He had left him a death sentence if he was caught, because at that very moment in the big house, Donna Leonor was sitting with a man who wasn't her lawyer. He was a stranger from the city, a man with sharp eyes and a black coat. They were talking about the sale of the estancia. They were talking about clearing out the assets, which meant the people. And Rosa, the young kitchen maid, was standing behind the door, her ear pressed to the wood. She heard Leonor's voice, sharp with desperation. "I don't care about the inventory," Leonor hissed. "The old man is dead. The papers are gone. The land is mine. Just get the notary here and sign the papers before anyone starts asking questions about the colonel's illness." Rosa's hand flew to her mouth. She remembered the small metal tube the colonel had been clutching the night he died. She remembered how Leonor had searched the room like a madwoman for hours after the pulse stopped. The widow thought she had won. She thought she had burned every bridge and buried every truth. But the truth was currently sitting on a grease-stained workbench in a slave's shack, hidden inside a pair of boots that everyone had laughed at. Bento looked at the key. He looked at the parchment. He knew he couldn't stay. If he stayed, he would die with the secret. But if he ran, Juvenal would hunt him down before he reached the main road. He needed a plan. He needed to get to the village of Tres Rios. He needed to find Dr. Munhoz, the only man the colonel had ever trusted. But the rain was starting to fall now, a heavy tropical downpour that would turn the roads into rivers of mud. And the boots, the very things that held his salvation, were falling apart. Bento picked up his needle and the thick waxed thread. He had to sew the secret back in. He had to make those boots look like garbage again. He had to walk in them, sleep in them, and live in them until the moment was right. He didn't know that Leonore was already suspicious. She was sitting by the window watching the rain, wondering why her husband had smiled right before he took his last breath. He had looked at Bento, then at his feet, and he had smiled. "The boots," she whispered to the empty room. He gave him the boots. She stood up, her face twisting into a mask of realization. She didn't know what was in them, but she knew her husband. He never did anything without a sting in the tail. "Juvenal!" she screamed into the hallway. The game had started, and Bento was still holding the needle. The sound of Leonore's voice was like a whip cracking through the heavy rain. Bento didn't wait. He knew that tone. It was the sound of a woman who had realized she had been outplayed by a dead man. His fingers, stiff and sore, worked the needle with a speed he didn't know he still possessed. He pushed the iron key back into its bed of wool. He slid the parchment into the hollow. He pulled the leather tight and began the stitch. Every puncture of the needle felt like a heartbeat. He had to close it. He had to make it look like the same piece of trash she had thrown in the mud. The boots were no longer just shoes. They were a bomb. And Bento was the one holding it in his lap. He heard the heavy thud of Juvenal's boots on the porch. The overseer was coming back and he wasn't alone. Bento could hear the rustle of Leonore's silk dress. She was coming to the stables herself. That was unheard of. The mistress didn't soil her shoes in the dirt unless there was something to kill or something to steal. Bento looked around his small shack. There was nowhere to hide something so large. The straw mattress. Too obvious. The rafters. Juvenal was tall enough to reach them. The floorboards were packed earth, frozen hard by the sudden cold. He did the only thing a man in a corner could do. He grabbed the boots, tucked them under his thin shirt, and slipped out the back window into the deluge. The rain hit him like a wall of ice, soaking him to the bone in seconds. He ran toward the back of the property, toward the pigsty. The smell was a thick, physical weight, rotting slop and animal waste. It was the last place a lady like Leonore would look. He reached the heavy wooden trough and shoved the boots deep into the muck beneath it, burying them under layers of filth and wet straw. He had just enough time to wipe his hands on his pants and circle back to the side of his shack when he saw the lantern light. "Bento!" Juvenal roared. The old man stepped into the light, shivering, his chest heaving. He played the part he had been forced to play for 50 years, the broken, tired servant. He let his shoulders slump. He let his gaze fall to the mud. "I'm here, Master Juvenal," Bento whispered. "The rain." "I was checking the roof." Leonore stood under a large black umbrella, held by a trembling houseboy. Her face was pale, her eyes darting around the shack. She didn't look at Bento. She looked at the workbench. "Where are they?" she asked. Her voice was thin, vibrating with a nervous energy that made the hair on Bento's neck stand up. "The boots, Sina," Bento asked, tilting his head. "I put them outside. They smelled of the grave. I thought I would let the rain wash the curse off them." Juvenal didn't wait for an order. He grabbed Bento by the collar and threw him against the wooden wall of the shack. The wood groaned. Bento felt the air leave his lungs. "Don't lie to us, old man," Juvenal hissed. He smelled of tobacco and damp wool. "The mistress thinks the colonel left a message, something he didn't want her to see. You tell us where you hid it or I'll start taking fingers." "I have nothing," Bento wheezed, the cold mud seeping into his clothes. "Search the shack, search the yard, it's just leather and rot. Why would the master leave me anything but his hate?" Leonore stepped into the shack. She looked at the bone-handled knife. She looked at the scraps of thread. She was a woman who had spent her life measuring the value of things, and she knew when a man was holding on to something precious. She walked over to Bento and leaned in close. He could smell the expensive lavender water she used to hide the scent of the sick room. "My husband died with a smile on his face," she said, her voice a low murmur that only Bento could hear. "He looked at you, and he looked at those boots, and he smiled. He never smiled at me, not once in 10 years. She straightened up and looked at Juvenal. "Search everything. If you find so much as a scrap of paper, bring it to me, and tomorrow put this one in the north fields." I want him under the sun until he can't stand. Maybe the heat will loosen his tongue. The north fields were where the plantation sent the men they wanted to break. It was rocky, uphill, and the overseer there was a man who enjoyed the sound of the lash more than the sound of music. The next morning the sun rose like a red wound in the sky. Bento was dragged from his sleep before the first bird sang. His muscles were screaming, his joints stiff from the cold and the damp. But as he was led away toward the hills, he looked back at the pigsty. The boots were still there, buried in the filth. The routine of injustice began. For 12 hours, Bento was forced to haul stones to clear a new patch of land. His hands, already scarred from years of leather work, began to bleed. The overseer in the north fields, a man named Silas, didn't give him water. He didn't give him rest. Every time Bento slowed down, the whip would bite into the dirt near his heels, a constant reminder of how thin the line was between life and death. But while his body was breaking, his mind was sharper than it had ever been. He thought about the iron key. What did it open? The colonel had a safe in the city and a small box in his desk, but Leonor already had the keys to those. This key was different. It was small, old, and made of heavy iron. It looked like the kind of key used for a church or a very old chest. And then there was the parchment. The seal was official, but the handwriting he had glimpsed was cramped and hurried. It wasn't a formal will written by a lawyer. It was a confession. Notice this. The powerful always think they can bury their sins in the dirt, but the dirt is where the roots grow. By midday, Bento's vision was swimming. The heat was a physical weight on his shoulders. He fell to his knees, dropping a heavy stone. Silas moved toward him, the whip uncoiling. "Get up, you lazy dog," Silas yelled. "Let him be, Silas. I'll take him to the well." The voice was soft, but it had an authority that made the overseer stop. It was Rosa. She was carrying a heavy clay jug of water for the field hands. She was only 20, but she had the eyes of someone who had seen too much. Silas spat on the ground. "Make it fast. The mistress wants him worked until he drops." Rosa helped Bento to the shade of a large jackfruit tree. She poured a bit of water into his hands. As he drank, she leaned in, her back to the overseer. "They searched your shack again this morning," she whispered. "Juvenal even tore up the floor. They didn't find anything." "They won't," Bento coughed. "Bento, listen to me," Rosa said, her voice trembling. "The night the colonel died, I was in the hallway. I heard them. The mistress was telling him that the coffee was almost finished. He told her she was a murderer. He said he had already sent word to the capital, but he was lying. He was too weak to send anyone." Bento looked at her. "The coffee?" "She was putting something in it. For months. A white powder she got from a man in the village. The colonel knew. He knew he was dying, and he spent his last days writing something. I saw him hide a metal tube, but the mistress found that. She thought she had it all." Bento felt a chill that had nothing to do with the shade. Leonor wasn't just a greedy widow. She was a killer. And the proof, the real proof, wasn't in a metal tube. It was in the boots. "He told her he was leaving everything to his loyal friend," Rosa continued. "She laughed. She thought he meant his brother in the city. She didn't realize he meant you." Bento gripped the water jug until his knuckles turned white. He wasn't just holding a secret, he was holding the rope that would hang the mistress of the house. But he was a prisoner in the fields, and the notary, Dr. Munhoz, was expected at the estate in 2 days to finalize the sale of the land. Once that paper was signed, the estancia would be gone, the workers would be sold off to different masters, and Bento's secret would be buried forever. The problem was that Juvenal was getting smarter. He had noticed that Bento wasn't looking at his shack. He was looking at the pigsty. If you don't swallow this kind of well-dressed lie, subscribe. And tell me, this iron key, was it a ticket to freedom or a nail in his coffin? That evening, as the workers were being marched back to the quarters, Bento saw Juvenal standing near the pigsty. He had a shovel in his hand. He was poking around the edges of the trough, his face twisted in concentration. Bento's heart skipped a beat. If Juvenal found the boots now, it was over. He would kill Bento on the spot to keep the secret for himself. Juvenal didn't care about Leonor, he cared about gold, and he assumed whatever was in those boots was worth a fortune. Bento had to act. He had to get those boots out of the filth and into the hands of someone who could use the truth. But Silas was right behind him, and the gates to the quarters were being locked. As he was pushed into his shack, Bento saw a small flickering light in the distance. A carriage. It was early. The notary wasn't supposed to be there until the day after tomorrow. The arrival of the law changed everything. Leonore would be desperate now. She would want the inventory finished tonight. She would want the assets accounted for. Bento sat in the dark, his hands bleeding, his stomach empty. He looked out the small window. He saw Juvenal walk away from the pigsty, frustrated, the boot still hidden. But the overseer wasn't giving up. He was heading toward the big house to talk to the mistress. Bento knew he wouldn't survive the night if he stayed in that shack. He had to move. He had to get to the boots, and he had to do it while the house was in a state of chaos with the notary's arrival. But as he reached for the latch on his door, he heard the sound of a key turning from the outside. "Mistress's orders," a voice said. It was Silas. "You stay in there until the sun comes up. No more checking the roof for you." Bento was locked in. The boots were in the mud. And the man who could save him was currently sitting in the great hall, drinking the same coffee that had killed the colonel. The air in the shack grew cold. Bento realized that Leonore wasn't just trying to break him, she was waiting for the notary to go to sleep. She was going to end this tonight. But what nobody knew was that Bento hadn't just hidden the boots. He had left a small trail, a trail that only someone who knew the colonel's habits would recognize. And as the rain started to fall again, someone was moving through the shadows toward the pigsty. Someone who wasn't Juvenal, someone who wasn't Bento. The game wasn't just between the mistress and the slave anymore. There was a third player in the dark. The wooden walls of the shack felt like they were closing in on Bento. The air was thick with the smell of old hide and the metallic tang of his own blood. Silas had locked the door, but he didn't know who he was dealing with. A man who spends 50 years working with his hands knows every weakness in a structure. Bento knew that the third board from the corner was held together by a rusted nail and a prayer. He didn't use a hammer. He used the weight of his own body, pressing against the wood until it groaned and gave way just enough for a man of his thin frame to slide through. The rain was a cold curtain, masking the sound of his movements. He crawled through the mud, his stomach churning. He wasn't thinking about freedom anymore. He was thinking about the coffee. If Dr. Munhoz drank the same brew the colonel had finished, the truth would die with him. The notary was a dry man, a man of stamps and seals, but he was the only bridge between Bento and a grave in the North Fields. As he neared the pigsty, his heart nearly stopped. A lantern was swaying in the dark. Juvenal was there, but he wasn't alone. He was shouting at someone, his voice muffled by the downpour. Bento stayed low, his face pressed into the wet earth. He saw a small figure huddled near the trough. It was Rosa. She was covered in filth, her hands clawing at the muck where the boots had been buried. "Where are they, you little rat?" Juvenal roared. He grabbed Rosa by the hair, forcing her head up. "I saw you lurking around here. I know the old man told you where he put them. Tell me, or I'll throw you in with the hogs." Rosa didn't scream. She didn't even cry. She was holding something tight against her chest, hidden under her ragged shawl. Bento felt a surge of pride and terror. The girl had found them. She had gone for the boots while he was locked away, but she was about to be broken by a man who had no soul left to lose. Bento knew he couldn't take Juvenal in a fight. The overseer was 20 years younger and twice his size. He had to use the only thing he had, the shadows. He picked up a heavy stone and threw it with all his might toward the stable doors. The wood cracked, the sound echoing through the yard like a gunshot. Juvenal spun around, his hand flying to the whip at his belt. "Who's there?" Bento didn't wait. He let out a low, guttural moan, a sound he had heard the colonel make in his final hours. It was the sound of a man dying in agony. In the dark, with the wind howling and the rain lashing down, even a man like Juvenal felt the cold finger of fear. He let go of Rosa, his eyes darting toward the stables. "Master Custodio?" Juvenal whispered, his voice trembling. He was a brutal man, but he was superstitious. He believed the dead didn't stay buried at Estancia dos Jacarandas. "If you don't swallow this kind of well-dressed lie, subscribe. And tell me, this proof, the boots, was it a message from the grave or a death sentence?" While Juvenal was staring into the darkness of the stables, Bento hissed at Rosa. "Run! To the chapel! Hide them under the altar!" Rosa didn't need to be told twice. She vanished into the rain, a shadow among shadows. Bento watched her go. Then he deliberately stepped into the light of Juvenal's lantern. He didn't try to hide. He wanted to be seen. He needed to be the target so Rosa could escape. "Looking for something, Juvenal?" Bento asked. He stood tall, the rain washing the mud from his face. Juvenal's fear turned into a white-hot rage in an instant. He lunged forward, his fist connecting with Bento's jaw. The old man went down, the world spinning into a blur of grey and black. He felt the cold mud fill his mouth. He felt the heavy boot of the overseer strike his ribs, once, twice. "Where is she?" Juvenal hissed, kneeling on Bento's chest. "Where did the girl take the boots?" "To the fire," Bento wheezed, a bloody smile stretching across his lips. "They're ashes by now, just like my freedom." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but it bought time. Juvenal dragged Bento to his feet and began hauling him toward the big house. He wasn't going to kill him yet. He was going to let Leonor do that. Inside the great hall, the scene was one of staged elegance. The silver candelabras were lit, and a fire crackled in the hearth. Dr. Munhoz sat at the long mahogany table, his spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose. He was reading through a pile of documents Leonor had provided. Leonor stood by the window, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked like a grieving widow, but the way she kept glancing at the notary's coffee cup told a different story. "Is everything in order, Doctor?" she asked. Her voice was sweet, but there was a sharp edge to it, like sugar-coated glass. "Most of it, Donna Leonor," Munhoz said without looking up. He took a sip of the coffee and frowned. He swirled the liquid in the porcelain cup. "The inventory is complete, the debts are listed, but there is a discrepancy in the marriage contract. The original registration from the province of São Paulo is missing. I only have a copy here, and the seal is remarkably faint." Leonor's face paled. "The colonel was a careless man with papers, Doctor. I'm sure it's just misplaced. The estate is mine, as is the debt. We just need your signature to finalize the sale to the buyers in the city." "The law doesn't care for sure, madam," Munhoz replied. He set the cup down. He hadn't finished it. Bento, watching through the glass door as Juvenal held him in the hallway, felt a spark of hope. The notary was suspicious. But then the door burst open. Juvenal threw Bento onto the polished floor. The old man slid across the wood, stopping at the feet of the notary. "He was trying to steal from the estate, Sinha," Juvenal panted. "He and the kitchen girl. They were digging in the yard." Leonor didn't look at Bento. She looked at Dr. Munhoz, who was now standing up, his face a mask of professional outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" Munhoz demanded. "Is this how you treat a man who served your husband for 30 years? "He is a thief, Doctor," Leonor said, her voice turning cold as ice. "He was looking for hidden gold. My husband was senile at the end. He told the slaves stories of buried treasure to amuse himself. Bento here believed him." She walked over to Bento and looked down at him. There was no lavender scent now, just the smell of burning wood and the stench of a woman who was losing control. "Where are they, Bento?" she whispered. "Tell the doctor what you were looking for." Bento looked up at the notary. He saw the man's eyes, intelligent, calculating. He saw the iron key in his mind's eye. He saw the parchment. He knew that if he spoke now, Juvenal would kill him before he finished the sentence. "I was looking for my master," Bento said, his voice cracking. "I was looking for the man who promised me I wouldn't die a slave." Leonor laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Your master is in the ground, and you're going to join him if you don't tell me where you put that pair of boots." The notary froze. "Boots? You are making this much trouble over a pair of shoes, Donna Leonor?" The silence that followed was heavy enough to break the floorboards. Leonor realized she had said too much. The notary wasn't a fool. He knew that in a house filled with silver and silk, no one hunts for old leather unless that leather is worth more than the silver. But the boots were gone. Rosa was in the chapel, and the chapel was the one place Juvenal wouldn't think to look, because he hadn't set foot in a holy place in 20 years. The problem was, Leonor knew the girl. She knew Rosa's mother had been a devout woman. She knew where the girl went when she was afraid. "Juvenal," Leonore said, her eyes never leaving Bento's face. "Check the chapel, and if you find her, don't bring her back. Just bring me what she's holding." Bento tried to stand, but Juvenal's heavy hand slammed him back down. The overseer turned to leave, but as he reached the door, the sound of a heavy bell began to ring. It wasn't the dinner bell. It was the bell of the chapel, ringing out in the middle of the night, calling for a soul that wasn't yet lost. Rosa was playing her final card. She was calling the entire plantation to witness. The notary looked from the widow to the slave, his hand hovering over the cup of poisoned coffee. He finally understood that he wasn't just here to sign a sale, he was here to witness a murder. The bell wouldn't stop. It was a rhythmic, desperate cry that cut through the thunder and the lashing rain. In the slave quarters, men who had been broken by the sun for decades sat up. They knew that sound. It wasn't the master calling them to the fields, it was a soul screaming for justice. The sound vibrated through the floorboards of the great hall, rattling the crystal glasses on the sideboard. Inside the hall, Leonore was vibrating with a rage that looked like madness. She grabbed a heavy silver candle snuffer and slammed it onto the mahogany table, inches from the notary's hand. "Stop that bell, Juvenal! I want her silenced!" she shrieked. Juvenal didn't need to be told twice. He stepped over Bento, his heavy boots grinding into the old man's fingers, and ran out into the storm. He had a machete in his hand now. He wasn't playing the overseer anymore. He was a predator, protecting his kill. He vanished into the darkness, leaving the front door swinging on its hinges. Bento lay on the floor, the world tilting. The pain in his ribs was a sharp, hot iron, but his mind was on Rosa. He felt a crushing weight of guilt. He had sent a girl to do a man's job, and now he could hear the silence that followed the last toll of the bell. The ringing stopped abruptly. The silence was worse than the noise. It felt like the end of the world. He closed his eyes, praying to the saints that the girl had been fast enough. "Sit down, doctor," Leonore whispered. Her voice had dropped into a terrifyingly calm register. She looked at the notary, Dr. Munhoz, who was staring at the door with a look of growing horror. "This is a private matter. Discipline is necessary on a plantation this size. We have a sale to finish, and my time is expensive." "Discipline is one thing, Donna Leonore," Munhoz said, his voice dry and hard. "But I have spent 30 years reading men and women. I see the way you look at that cup of coffee. And I see the way you look at this old man on the floor. There is no grief in this house, only hunger." Munhoz reached out and picked up the porcelain cup. He didn't drink. He tilted it toward the light of the fireplace. At the bottom, a fine white silt had settled. It looked like sugar, but it didn't dissolve. "My wife used to use a powder like this for her nerves," Munhoz said, his eyes locking onto Leonore's. "In small doses, it brings sleep. In large doses, it stops the heart. It looks like a natural failure, like the one that took your husband." Leonore didn't flinch. She was a woman who had already crossed the river of no return. "You have no proof, and you have no authority here until those papers are signed. Sign them, and you leave with your gold. Refuse, and you might find that the road back to the city is very dangerous in this storm. Accidents happen on these muddy tracks, Doctor." The threat was naked. The room felt smaller, the shadows longer. Bento, pushing himself up with agonizing slowness, saw the fear in the notary's eyes. The law was a powerful thing, but it was thin against a woman with a machete-wielding animal at her command. Bento felt a cold realization. Leonore wasn't going to let any of them leave the estancia alive. But the problem was that Leonore had forgotten one thing. A man who ignores the small things loses the big ones. She had ignored the man waiting at the gate of the Povoado de Tres Rios, the one the colonel had written to weeks before his illness took hold. The front door didn't just open, it was kicked off its hinges. The wind howled into the hall, blowing out half the candles. A man stood in the doorway, drenched, his coat heavy with water. He wasn't Juvenal. Behind him stood the field hands, dozens of them, their faces grim and lit by the occasional flash of lightning. They were armed with scythes and heavy tools, their eyes fixed on the mistress. The man in the coat stepped forward. He was holding the right boot. It was dripping mud onto the expensive rug, but he held it like it was made of solid gold. He looked at Bento, then at Leonore, with eyes that held no mercy. "The girl is safe," the stranger said, "and the colonel's last debt is about to be paid." Leonore's face turned the color of ash. She looked at the boot, then at Bento, then at the notary. The turning point had arrived. The secret wasn't just in the heel anymore, it was in the room, and the air was thick with the scent of a coming reckoning. Leonore lunged for the boot, her fingers clawing like talons. The stranger, the colonel's nephew, shoved her back with a single firm hand. He handed the right boot to Dr. Munhoz. The notary didn't hesitate. He reached for a silver letter opener on the desk and jammed the blade into the hidden seam of the heel. The leather groaned and snapped. A small iron key and a tightly rolled parchment fell onto the mahogany table, landing right next to the poisoned coffee cup. Munhoz unrolled the paper, his eyes moving rapidly. The room was so silent, you could hear the wax melting on the candles. "This is a marriage certificate from the southern province," Munhoz said, his voice hard as flint. "Dated 3 years before your wedding, Donna Leonore. The colonel's first wife is still alive. Your marriage was bigamous, it was never legal. You have no claim to this name, this house, or this land." He picked up the second paper, his face twisting in disgust. "And this is a formal accusation. He tracked the apothecary where you bought the arsenic. He even kept the secret ledger of your debts. He knew you were killing him, and he spent his last breaths ensuring you would lose everything." The constables stepped out from behind the field hands. They grabbed Leonore's silk-clad arms. She didn't scream anymore. She just stared at Bento, her face a mask of frozen, hollow hate. Juvenal, seeing the tide had turned, slipped out the back door and vanished into the storm-darkened woods. He was never heard from again. Bento stood up, his back straighter than it had been in decades. The nephew handed him the iron key. It opened a small chest in the capital containing enough gold to buy a dozen houses. But more importantly, Dr. Munhoz handed him a new parchment, freshly stamped. The real one. Bento was finally a man of his own name. Subscribe. Here we pull up what they tried to bury. And comment. Do you think anyone else in that house knew about the poison? Or did they all just choose to look away to keep their own peace? The Estancia dos Jacarandas changed hands that night. It wasn't steel or fire that brought down the mistress, but a pair of torn boots and the patience of a man who knew how to wait. You looked at the mud on the leather, but you forgot to look at what the leather was protecting. A man who ignores the small things always loses the big ones.